Hello guys, namaste and welcome back to my channel. And today I thought that I would do some story reading of Ruskin Bond, because for those who don't know, yesterday was Ruskin Bond's 89th birthday. So I thought, why not just commemorate that, and I think that would be very cool. So there was but one tree in the street known as Gali Ramnath, an ancient banyan tree that had grown through the cracks of an abandoned mosque, and little Ali's kite had caught in its branches. The boy, barefoot and clad only in a torn shirt, ran along the cobbled stones of the narrow street to where his grandfather sat, nodding dreamily in the sunshine of the back courtyard. "Grandfather," shouted the boy, "my kite has gone." The old man woke up from his daydream with a start and, raising his head, displayed a beard that would have been white had it not been dyed red with mehendi leaves. The old man woke from his. Okay, I said that. "Did the twine break?" he asked. "I know that kite twine is not what it used to be." "No, grandfather, the kite is stuck in a banyan tree." The old man chuckled. "You have yet to learn how to fly a kite properly, my child, and I am too old to teach you. That's the pity of it. But you shall have another." He had just finished making a new kite from bamboo paper and thin silk, and it lay in the sun, firming up. It was a pale pink kite with a small green tail. The old man handed it to Ali, and the boy raised himself on his toes and kissed his grandfather's hollowed out cheeks. "I will not lose this one," he said. "This kite will fly like a bird." And he turned on his heel and skipped out of the courtyard. The old man remained dreaming in the sun. His kite shop was gone, the premises long since sold to a junk dealer. But he still made kites, for his own amusement and for the benefit of his grandson Ali. Not many people bought kites these days. Adults disdained them, and children preferred to spend their money at the cinema. Moreover, there were not many open spaces left for flying of kites. The city had swallowed up the open grassland that had stretched from the old fort's wall to the river bank. But the old man remembered a time when grown men flew kites and the great battles were fought. The kites swerving and swooping in the city, tangling with each other until the sting of one was severed. Then the defeated but liberated kite would float away into the blue unknown. There was a good deal of betting, and money frequently changed hands. Kite flying was then the sport of kings, and the old man remembered how the Nawab himself would come down to the riverside with his retinue to participate in this noble pastime. There was time then to spend an idle hour with a gay dancing strip of paper. Now everyone hurried in a heat of hope, and delicate things like kites and daydreams were trampled underfoot. He, Mahmoud the kite maker, had, in the prime of his life, been well known throughout the city. Some of his more elaborate kites once sold for as much as 3 or 4 rupees each. At the request of the Nawab, he had once made a very special kind of kite, unlike any that had been in the district. It consisted of a series of small, very light paper discs trailing on a thin bamboo frame. To the end of each disc, he fixed a sprig of grass, forming a balance on both sides. The surface of the foremost disc was slightly convex, and a fantastic face was painted on it, having 2 eyes made of small mirror. The disc, decreasing in size from head to tail, assumed an unadulterated form and gave the kite the appearance of a crawling serpent. It required great skill to raise this cumbersome device from the ground, and only Mahmoud could manage it. Everyone had heard of the dragon kite that the Mahmoud had built, and word went out that it possessed supernatural powers. A large crowd assembled in the open to watch its first public launching in the presence of the Nawab. At the first attempt, it refused to leave the ground. The disc made a plaintive, protestive sound, and the sun was trapped in the little mirrors and made of the kite a living, complaining creature. And then the wind came from the right direction, and the dragon kite soared into the sky, wriggling its way higher and higher, with the sun still glinting in its devil eyes. And where it went very high, it pulled fiercely on the twine, and Mahmud's young sons had to help him with the reel. But still the kite pulled, determined to be free, to break loose, to live a life of its own, and eventually it did so. The twine snapped. The kite leaped away toward the sun, sailed on heavenward until it was lost to view. It was never found again, and Mahmud wondered afterward if he made too vivid, too living a thing of the great kite. He did not make another kite like it, and instead he presented to the Nawab a musical kite, one that made a sound like a violin when it rose in the air. Those were more leisurely, more spacious days. But the Nawab had died years ago, and his descendants were almost as poor as Mahmud himself. Kite makers, like poets, once had their patrons, but no one knew Mahmud simply because there were too many people in the gully, and they could not be bothered with their neighbors. When Mahmud was younger and had fallen sick, everybody in the neighborhood had come to ask after his health. But now, when his days were drawing to a close, no one visited him. True, most of his old friends were dead and his sons had grown up. No one was working in a local garage, and others had been in Pakistan at the time of partition and had not been able to rejoin his relatives. The children who had bought kites from him 10 years ago were now grown men, struggling for a living. They did not have time for the old man and his memories. They had grown up in a swiftly changing and competitive world, and they looked at the old kite maker and the banyan tree with the same indifference. Both were taken for granted, permanent fixtures that were of no concern to the raucous, sweating mass of humanity that surrounded them. No longer did people gather under the banyan tree to discuss their problems and their plans. Only in the summer months did a few seek shelter from the fierce sun. But there was the boy, his grandson. It was good that Mahmud's son worked close by, for it gladdened the old man's heart to watch the small boy at play in the winter sunshine, growing under his eyes like a young and well-nourished sapling, putting forth new leaves each day. There is a great affinity between trees and men. We grow at much the same pace if we are not hurt or starved or cut down. In our youth we are resplendent creatures, and in our declining years we stoop a little. We remember, we stretch our brittle limbs in the sun, and then, with a sigh, we shed our last leaves. Mahmud was like the banyan. His hand gnarled and twisted like the roots of the ancient tree. Ali like the young mimosa planted at the end of the courtyard. In 2 years, both he and the tree would acquire the strength and confidence of their early youth. The voices in the street grew fainter, and Mahmud wondered if he was going to fall asleep and dream, as so he often did, of a kite so beautiful and powerful that it would resemble the great white bird of the Hindus, Garud, God Vishnu's famous steed. He would like to make a wonderful new kite for little Ali. He had nothing else to leave the boy. He heard Ali's voice in the distance, but did not realize the boy was calling him. The voice seemed to come from very far away. Ali was at the courtyard door, asking if his mother had as yet returned from the bazaar. When Mahmud did not answer, the boy came forward repeating his question. The sunlight was slanting across the old man's head, and a small white butterfly rested on his flowing beard. Mahmud was silent, and when Ali put his small brown hand on the old man's shoulder, he met with no response. The boy heard a faint sound, like the rubbing of a marbles in his pocket. Suddenly afraid, Ali turned and moved to the door, and then ran down the street shouting for his mother. The butterfly left the old man's beard and flew to the mimosa tree, and a sudden gust of wind caught the torn kite and lifted it in the air, carrying it far above the struggling city into the blind blue sky. My father's tree in Dehra. Our trees still grow in Dehra. This is one part of the world where trees are a match for man, and old people may be cut down to make way for a new building. Two people trees will sprout from the walls of the building. In Dehra, the air is moist. The soil is hospitable to seeds and probing roots. The valley of Dehradun lies between the first range of the Himalayas and the smaller but older Shivalik range. Dehra is an old town, but it was not in the reign of Rajput prince or Mughal king that it really grew and flourished. It acquired a certain size and importance with the coming of British and Anglo-Indian settlers. The English have an affinity with trees, and in the rolling hills of Dehra they discovered a retreat which, in spite of snakes and mosquitoes, reminded them just a little bit of England's green and pleasant land. The mountains to the north are austere and inhospitable. The plains to the south are flat, dry, and dusty. But Dehra is green. I look out of the train window at daybreak to see the sal and shisham trees swept by majestically, while trailing vines and great clumps of bamboo give the forest a darkness and density which add to its mystery. There are still a few tigers in these forests, only a few. Perhaps they will survive to stalk the spotted deer and drink at forest pools. I grew up in Dehra. My grandfather built a bungalow on the outskirts of the town at the turn of the century. The house was sold a few years after independence. No one knows me now in Dehra, for it is over 20 years since I left the place, and my boyhood friends are scattered and lost. And although the India of Kim is no more, and the Grand Trunk Road is now a procession of trucks instead of slow moving caravans of horses and camels, India is still a country in which people are easily lost and quickly forgotten. From the station, I take either a taxi or a tonga. I can either take a taxi or a snappy little scooter rickshaw. That I had neither before 1950. But because I am unashamedly sentimental pilgrimage, I take a tonga drawn by a lean, listless pony and driven by a tubercular old Muslim in a shabby green waistcoat. All 2 or 3 tongas stand outside the station. There were always 20 or 30 here in the 1940s. When I came home from boarding school to be met at the station by my grandfather. But the days of the tonga are nearly over, and in many ways this is a good thing, because most tonga ponies are overworked and underfed. Its wheel squeaked from lack of oil and its seat slipping out from under me. The tonga drags me through the bazaars of Dehra. A couple of miles at this slow funeral pace makes me impatient to use my own legs, and I dismiss the tonga when we get to the small Dilaram Bazaar. It is a good place from which to start walking. The Dilaram Bazaar has not changed very much. The shops are run by a new generation of bakers, barbers, and banias, but professions have not changed. The cobblers belong to the lower caste, the bakers are Muslims, the tailors are Sikhs. Boys still fly kites from the flat rooftops, and women wash clothes on the canal steps. The canal steps from Rajpur and goes underground here to emerge about a mile away. I have to walk only a furlong to reach my grandfather's house. The road is lined with eucalyptus, jacaranda, and laburnum trees. In the compound there are small groves of mangoes, lychees, and papayas. The poinsettia thrusts its scarlet leaves over garden walls. Every veranda has its bougainvillea creeper, every garden its bed of marigolds. Potted palms, though symbol of Victorian snobbery, are popular with Indian housewives. There are a few houses, but most of the bungalows were built by old India hands on their retirement from the army, the police, or the railways. Most of the present owners are Indian businessmen or government officials. I'm standing outside my grandfather's house. The wall has been raised and the wicket gate has disappeared. I cannot get a clear view of the house and garden. The nameplate identifies the owner as Major General Sehgal. The house had more than one owner since my grandparents sold it in 1949. On the other side of the road, there is an orchard of lychee trees. This is not the season for fruit, and there is no one looking after the garden. By taking a little path that goes through the orchard, I reach higher ground and gain a better view of our old house. Grandfather built the house with granite rocks taken from the foothills. It shows no signs of age. The lawn has disappeared, but the big jackfruit tree, giving shade to the side veranda, is still there. In this tree, I spent my afternoons, absorbed in my magnets, champions, and hotspurs, while sticky mango juice trickled down my chin. One could not eat the jackfruit unless it was cooked into a vegetable curry. There was a hole in the bole of the tree which I kept my pocket knife, catapult, and any badges or buttons that could be saved from my father's RAF tunics when he came home on leave. There was also an iron cross, a relic of the First World War given to me by my grandfather. I managed to keep the iron cross, but what did I do with the top and catapult? Memory fails me. I've managed. Possibly they are still in the hold in the jackfruit tree. I must have forgotten to collect them when we went away after my father's death. I'm seized by a whimsical urge to walk in at the gate, climb into the branches of the jackfruit tree, and recover my lost possessions. What would the present owner, the major retired, have to say if I politely asked permission to look for a catapult left behind more than 20 years ago? An old man is coming down the path through the lychee trees. He is not a major general but a poor street vendor. He carried a small tin trunk on his head and walks away slowly. When he sees me, he stops and asks me if I will buy something. I can think of nothing I need, but the old man looks so tired, so very old, that I'm afraid he will collapse if he moves any further along the path without resting. So I ask him to show me his wares. He cannot get the box off his head by himself, but together we manage to set it down in the shade, and the old man insists on spreading its entire content on the grass. Bangles, combs, shoelaces, safety pins, cheap stationery, buttons, pomades, elastic, and scores of other household necessities. When I refuse buttons because there is no one to sew them for me, he plies me safety pins. I say no, but as he moves from one article to another, his querulous, persuasive voice slowly wears down my resistance, and I end up buying envelopes, a letter pad, a 1 rupee fountain pen guaranteed to leak, and several yards of elastic. I have no idea what I will do with the elastic, but the old man convinced me that I cannot live without it. Exhausted by the efforts of selling me a lot of things I obviously do not want, he closed his eyes and leans back against the trunk of a lychee tree. For a moment I feel rather nervous. Is he going to die sitting here beside me? He sinks to his haunches and puts his chin on his hand. He only wants to talk. I am very tired, Huzoor, he says. Please do not mind if I sit here for a while. Rest for as long as you like, I say. That's a heavy load you've been carrying. He comes to life at the chance of a conversation and says, When I was a young man, it was nothing. I could carry my box up from Rajpur to Mussoorie by the bridle path, 7 steep miles. But now I find it difficult to cover the distance from the station to the Dilaram Bazaar. Naturally, you are quite old. I am 70, Sahib. You look very fit for your age. I say this to please him. He looks frail and brittle. Isn't there someone to help you? I ask. I had a servant boy last month, but he stole my earnings and ran off to Delhi. I wish my son was alive. He would not have permitted me to work like a mule for a living, but he was killed in the riots in the 47. Have you no other relatives? I have outlived them all. That is the curse of a healthy life. Your friends, your loved ones all go before you, and at the end, you are left alone. But I must go too before long. The road to the bazaar seems to grow longer every day. The stones are harder, the sun is hotter in the summer, and the wind's much colder in the winter. Even some of the trees that were there in my youth have grown old and have died. I have outlived the trees. He has outlived the trees. He is like an old tree himself, gnarled and twisted. I have the feeling that if he falls asleep in the orchard, he will strike root hair, sending out crooked branches. I can imagine a small bent tree wearing a black waistcoat, a living scarecrow. He closes his eyes again but goes on talking. The English Mem Sahibs would buy great quantities of elastic. Today it is ribbons and bangles for the girls and combs for the boys. But I do not make much money, not because I cannot walk very far. How many houses do I reach in a day? 10, 15. But 20 years ago I could visit more than 50 houses. That makes a difference. Have you always been here? Most of my life, Hazur. I was here before they built the motor road to Missouri. I was here when the Sahibs had their own carriages and ponies and the Mem Sahibs their own rickshaws. I was here before there was any cinema. I was here when the Prince of Wales came to Dehradun. Oh, I have been here a long time, Hazur. I was here when that house was built, he says, pointing with his chin toward my grandfather's house. 50, 60 years ago it must have been. I cannot remember exactly. What is 10 years when you've lived 70? But it was a tall, red-bearded Sahib who built that house. He kept many creatures as pet. A kachua, a turtle was one of them, and there was a python which crawled into my box one day and gave me a terrible fright. The Sahib used to keep it hanging from his shoulder like a garland. His wife, the Burra Mem, always bought a lot from me, lots of elastics, and there were sons, one a teacher, another in the Air Force, and there were always children in the house, beautiful children, but they went away many years ago. Everyone has gone away. I do not tell him that I am one of those beautiful children. I doubt if he would believe me. His memories are of another age, another place, and for him there are no strong bridges into the present. But others have come, I say. True, and that is as it should be. That is not my complaint. My complaint, should God be listening, is that I have been left behind. He gets slowly to his feet and stands over his shabby tin box, gazing down at it with a mixture of disdain and affection. I help him to lift and balance it on the flattened cloth on his head. He does not have the energy to turn and make a salutation of any kind, but setting his sight on the distant hills, he walks down the path with steps that are shaky and slow, but still wonderfully straight. I wonder how much longer he will live. Perhaps a year or two, perhaps a week, perhaps an hour. It will be an end of living, but it will not be death. He is too old for death. He can only sleep, he can only fall gently like an old, crumpled brown leaf. I leave the orchard. The bend in the road hides my grandfather's house. I reach the canal again. It emerges from under a small culvert, where ferns and maidenhair grow in the shade. The water, coming from a stream in the foothills, rushes along with a familiar sound. It does not lose its momentum until the canal has left the gently sloping streets of town. There are new buildings on this road, but the small police station is housed in the same old lime-washed bungalow. A couple of off-duty policemen, partly uniformed but with their pajamas on, stroll hand in hand on the grass verge. Holding hands with the person of same sex, of course, is common practice in North India and denotes no special relationship. I cannot forget this little police station. Nothing very exciting ever happened in its vicinity until 1947. Communal riots broke out in Dehra. Then bodies were regularly fished out of the canal and dumped on a growing pile in the station compound. I was only a boy, but when I looked over the wall at the pile of corpses, there was no one who paid any attention to me. They were too busy to send me away. At the same time, they knew I was perfectly safe. While Hindu and Muslims were at each other's throat, a white boy could walk the streets in safely. No one was any longer interested in Europeans. The people of Dehra are not violent by nature, and the town has no history of communal discord. But when refugees from partitioned Punjab poured into Dehra in their thousands, the atmosphere became charged with tensions. These refugees, many of them sick, had lost their homes and livelihood. Many had seen their loved ones butchered. They were in a fierce and vengeful frame of mind. The calm, sleepy atmosphere of Dehra was shattered during 2 months of looting and murder. Those Muslims who could not run away fled. The poorer members of the community remained in a refugee camp until the Holocaust was over. Then they returned to their former occupations, frightened and deeply mistrustful. The old boxman was one of them. I crossed the canal and took the road that would lead me to the riverbed. This was one of my father's favorite walks. He too was a walking man. Often when he was home on leave, he would say, "Ruskin, let's go for a walk." And we would slip off together and walk down to the riverbed or in the sugarcane fields or across the railway station line and into the jungle. On one of these walks before independence, I remember him saying, "After the war is over, we'll be going to England. Would you like that?" "I don't know," I said. "Can't we stay in India?" "It won't be ours anymore." "Has it always been ours?" I asked. "For a long time," he said. "Over 200 years, but we have to give it back now." "Give it back to whom?" I asked. I was only 9. "To the Indians," said my father. The only Indians I had known till then were my ayah and the cook and the gardener and their children, and I could not imagine them wanting to be rid of us. The only other Indian who came to the house was Dr. Ghosh, and it was frequently said that he was more English than the English. I could understand my father better when he said, "After the war, there'll be a job for me in England, there'll be nothing for me here." The war had at first been a distant event, but somehow it kept coming closer. My aunt, who lived in London with her 2 children, was killed with them during an air raid. Then my father's younger brother died of dysentery on the long walk out from Burma. Both these tragic events depressed my father. Never in good health, he had been prone to attacks of malaria. He looked more worn and wasted every time he came home. His personal life was far from being happy, as he and my mother had separated, she to marry again. I think he looked forward to a great deal to the days he spent with me, far more than I could have realized at the time. I was someone to come back to, someone for whom things could be planned, someone who could learn from him. Dehra suited him. He was always happy when he was among trees, and this happiness communicated itself to me. I felt like drawing close to him. I remember sitting beside him on the veranda steps when I noticed the tendril of a creeping vine that was trailing near my feet. As we sat there doing nothing in particular, in the best gardens, time has no meaning. I found that the tendril was moving almost imperceptibly away from me and towards my father. 20 minutes later, it had crossed the veranda step and was touching his feet. This, in India, is the sweetest of salutation. There is probably a scientific explanation for the plant's behavior, something to do with the light and the warmth of the veranda step, but I like to think that its movements were motivated simply by an affection for my father. Sometimes, when I sat alone beneath a tree, I felt a little lonely or lost. As soon as my father rejoined me, the atmosphere lightened, the tree itself became more friendly. Most of the fruit trees around the house were planted by my father, but he was not content with planting trees in the garden. On raining days, we would walk beyond the riverbed, armed with cuttings and saplings, and then we would amble through the jungle, planting flowering shrubs between the sal and shisham trees. "But no one comes here," I protested the first time. "Who is going to see them?" "Someday," he said. Someone may come this way if people keep cutting trees instead of planting them. There'll soon be no forest left at all, and the world will be just one vast desert. The prospect of a world without tree became a sort of nightmare for me, and one reason why I shall never want to live on a treeless moon. And I assisted my father in his tree planting with great enthusiasm. One day the trees will move again, he said. They've been standing still for 1,000 of years. There was a time when they could walk about like people, but someone casted a spell on them and rooted them to one place. But they're always trying to move. See how they reach out with their arms. We found an island, a small rocky islet in the middle of a dry river bed. It was one of those riverbeds so common in the foothills, which are completely dry in the summer but flooded during the monsoon rains. The rains had just begun, and the stream could still be crossed on foot when we set out with a number of tamarinds, laburnum, and coral tree saplings and cuttings. We spent day planting them on an island, then ate our lunch in the shelter of a wild plum. My father went away soon after that tree planting. 3 months later, in Calcutta, he died. I was sent to boarding school. My grandparents sold the house and left Tehran. After school, I went to England. 3 years passed, my grandparents died, and when I returned to India, I was the only member of the family in the country. And now I am in Dehra again, on the road to the riverbed. The house with the trim gardens are soon behind me, and I am walking through field of flowering mustard, which make a carpet of yellow blossom stretching away toward the jungle and the foothill. The riverbed is dry, and at this time of the year, a herd of skinny cattle graze on the short brown grass at the edge of the jungle. The silk tree have been thinned out. Could our trees have survived? Will our island be there? Or has some flash flood during a heavy monsoon washed it away completely? As I look across the dry watercourse, my eye is caught by the spectacular red plumes of the chloral blossoms. In contrast with the dry, rocky riverbed, the little island is a green oasis. I walk across to the trees and notice that a number of parrots have come to live in them. A quail bird challenges me with a rising, "Who are you? Who are you?" But the trees seem to know me. They whisper among themselves and beckon me nearer. And looking round, I find that other trees and wild plants and grasses have sprung up under the protection of the trees we planted. They have multiplied. They are moving in the small, forgotten corner of the world. My father's dreams are coming true, and the trees are moving again.